Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webcast. My name is Steve Parrish, and I'm a professor of practice and scholar in residence at the American College of Financial Services. So today's presentation will be an update on Social Security. And just so you know, this presentation is being recorded and will be available on demand next week. I'm going to go ahead and get this whole thing going by making an introduction. I'm really thrilled to have two experts joining me today. Jason Fichtner, Executive Director, Retirement Income Institute, Alliance for Lifetime Income, and also Art Prunier, our adjunct instructor, whose name that I would imagine is familiar to any of you who are on this broadcast who have been involved with the RICP program. So welcome to both of you. I got to tell you, we're really keeping Jason busy recently. He was a keynote at our highly successful inaugural Horizons Retirement Conference 2 weeks ago. And he also was my guest at a Shares podcast at the beginning of this month. So be sure to check that out on our website. Okay, well, let's get started. We're in a unique situation right now. I think everybody knows that. The turmoil going on in DC has included the Social Security Administration. And I noticed, Jason, that you were quoted in the New York Times yesterday that with what's going on with Doge and all, quote, is more like a drunk operating operating a wrecking ball. Our hope is to avoid only focusing on these really highly charged issues of the day, because they'll probably change by tomorrow. And frankly, we really want to focus most of our attention on addressing these substantive issues that are going on with Social Security. What we want to do is focus on, first of all, the Social Security Fairness Act, and then the trust fund. And then how do you, as advisors, how can you counsel your clients in these really challenging times? That said, we will address the realities of the day. There's just no way you can avoid it. So, Jason, let's start with you. Let's start by getting an understanding of the chronology of the changes to Social Security law that we experienced in December. You were involved with testimony to Congress about the fairness issues related to government workers who were affected by the windfall elimination provision, the WP, and the government pension offset, the GPO. I think we can assume that the audience is at least somewhat familiar with these issues. So can you tell us the bottom line of the results of the Fairness Act? In other words, what did they do?
Sure. So first of all, hello, everybody. And Steve, thank you for having me. And Art, hello. By way of background, I was also the Deputy Commissioner and Chief Economist at the Social Security Administration. I spent 2 years under President Bush and 2 years under President Obama. And I've testified twice about WEBGPO provisions. And at the end of last year, Congress passed, and then the President signed into law on January 5th of 2025, the elimination of WEBGPO. And these provisions were designed to reduce or eliminate Social Security benefits for those who had some covered employment in Social Security, but primarily got income from a pension from a state and local government, which was non-covered employment. And right now, there's about 3.2 million Americans or so who receive a pension based on work that was not covered by Social Security, and then did not pay sort of Social Security taxes enough to basically offset their pension. And what they basically, this is teachers, firefighters, police officers, some folks in the civil service retirement system for the federal government. And what was happening is that, the Social Security Administration was not getting up-to-date records from some state and localities that were not paying into Social Security. And they did have some covered employment. Maybe they spent 10 years, they had their 40 quarters of coverage, working in traditional jobs that were paying into Social Security. But Social Security only saw that and did not see their state and local pension coverage. And so Social Security would send out to potential beneficiaries those statements you would get once a year at one point in time, and now you have to go online to get them. That said, hey, if you keep working as you're working, you're going to get this benefit when you retire. Let's say it was $1,500. Not knowing whether they had a pension then, when these individuals got a pension, Social Security would basically reduce their Social Security amount to offset that pension income. So people who were planning on getting a pension and then say $1,500 and just making that number up from Social Security found that $1,500 would go down to say $1,000 or $500 depending on the offset, and then complain that they had planned for this benefit and thought it was getting stolen from them. And technically, the way that progressive benefit for Social Security works is that it looks at your lifetime earnings and gives you a progressive rate structure for lower income workers. So if you're a lower lifetime earner, you get a higher replacement rate than somebody who is a higher lifetime earner. but the average replacement rate is about 40%. And the WEBGPO basically tried to equalize the benefit payments people were getting from a pension and from Social Security so that it matched the entire system if someone just had earnings that were covered by Social Security. So the name of the act, by basically calling it the Social Security Fairness Act, is a little misnamed. Some people might reply or imply that it really is unfair to give these benefits, but nonetheless, it is now the law. And so we're now going to see some back payments retroactive to January of this year, and people will be getting a retroactive check. And then going forward, starting in January, there is no longer a WEBGPO provision for Social Security.
Right. And I think that's a great summary. And I'm going to drill that down a little more here with you, Art. Taking what we have, some non-covered government workers and teachers, like we talked about, felt really profoundly, wronged because of those prior WEP and GPO provisions that we've had since the 1980s. So why did these individuals feel so strongly about the issue? I mean, what was bugging them about it?
Well, if you put the next slide on, Steve.
Sure.
Yeah, there's no question about it. People were writing their congressional representatives, not by the hundreds or thousands, but by the tens of thousands, feeling that they were having their earned Social Security benefits taken away. And I like to view this from a behavioral finance perspective. As Jason has already mentioned, people were either getting paper statements or going online to their My Social Security accounts, seeing a quoted benefit number at various ages, and those people would have anchored on those unreduced benefit amounts. Now, to be sure, people would have seen, if they had read a statement letting them know that in cases of uncovered employment, that there would be a reduction. But there was no indication of what the size of the reduction would be. So people anchored on a dollar amount. Now, we know from behavioral finance that people really dislike losses. Loss aversion is you have a much stronger emotional reaction to a loss than you have a feeling of pleasantness toward a gain. And in fact, the loss feels about twice as painful. So these people who oftentimes might be seeing well more than $500 a month of loss when they finally begin getting their retirement insurance benefit payment, or perhaps if they were anticipating getting a spousal benefit, that would have been completely lost, or for survivor benefits, substantially lost, very emotionally painful. And people responded. They wrote their congressional representatives for year after year after year, and this clearly had an effect. And I think most of us know that if there appears to be an easy solution, that Congress will follow through. And I think that they viewed this Fairness Act as a fairly easy solution to multitudes of constituents who are very upset. Now, Jason's already mentioned the fact that Social Security benefits formula is progressive. The subtleties of this being a progressive formula, I'm sure it was unrecognized by the large majority of recipients. Or even if it was recognized, I think most of them would have, once again, just viewed it as simply unfair, Steve.
Yeah. And I should add, because it's in the Q&A, I think I might have misspoke. The payments are retroactive to January of 2024. I think I said 2025, so my apologies. And then someone also asked about whether this worsens the trust fund depletion date, and it does by about 6 months.
Yeah, and we'll get to that. So yeah, I'm glad you saw that. Art, so that's kind of where the people were coming from that were not covered. Now, but as we all know, some commentators have stated Social Security Fairness Act created a new type of income unfairness, if you will, in the process of getting rid of WEP and GPO. That's hard to say. So can you explain to our listeners what the commentators are talking about? I mean, you got rid of it. It was a bad deal. What's wrong?
Well, if you go to the next slide, people are always comparing their situation to the situations of others. And it's impossible to have, I think, any federal program that treats every last citizen the same. So they're always, so to speak, going to be winners and losers. So eliminating the WEP and the GPO has shifted the playing field now. Okay, so I have two situations on this slide. Let's just start with single individuals, dual careers. People whose dual career was mostly uncovered employment, but maybe they also on the side or later in life had a covered employment job and had enough earnings to get the 40 credits required to be eligible for their retirement insurance benefit. These people now may easily beat out otherwise equivalent workers who may have had one type of employment during most of their life and then maybe had an encore career, but they always and only paid into the Social Security Trust Fund. Okay? Because for the people who went uncovered and then covered jobs, that covered job looks, from the perspective of the progressive formula used in Social Security, as if they were lifetime low-income earners. And the program is set up for low earners to give them a higher replacement rate to help them out, because supposedly with low income, they wouldn't have been able to save much for their retirement. Now, a person who had an encore career, had always been on Social Security, now sees that encore career maybe leading to very little or no increase in their Social Security benefits, because perhaps their highest 35 years were from the higher paying previous job. They're looking at this and saying, hey, I'm not getting a good deal compared to these other people who had split careers. Married couples also have a similar situation. I think even here, it might even be stronger in terms of the new disparities. So you have one married couple where one spouse completely worked under a non-covered job. The other spouse was covered. Okay? In this situation, they can easily beat out an otherwise equivalent earning couple where both paid into Social Security. Now, why is this? Well, first of all, let's think about survivor benefits. Okay? For the uncovered covered spouse, it doesn't really matter which one dies first, because the uncovered pension will continue on and the Social Security now will continue on as a survivor benefit. That household, in that very sad situation of the first death, is to continue to have a high income. But what about that couple where both were covered under Social Security? Okay, as we all know, only the higher benefit continues, and especially for situations where both spouses were more or less equal in their working career, it can come down to a halving. One half is all that's left on the Social Security side. And so, if these two couples are comparing each other, the couple that both paid into Social Security, that's all they paid into, they look at the other couple and say, hey, they're getting a better deal than we are, and they didn't pay into this as much. For the spousal benefits before that first death, it's not always true that the uncovered covered spouse combination comes out ahead. But for example, I think the clients who might be typical for financial advisors, medium or upper income folks, I think in those situations, you run the numbers, and because there's no offset for the spousal benefit, that uncovered spouse is going to get a spousal benefit from the Social Security covered spouse, whereas with two covered spouses, hey, oftentimes there's no spousal benefit. They both just get the benefit they earned, and that's the way it is. Now, whether a lot of two covered spouses recognize what's going on, I think right now, not yet. It's going to be interesting to see what happens if there becomes a general recognition out there among the American public and retirees about what this change entails for the majority of Social Security recipients. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and I've seen some of your numbers on that. It will be interesting when that starts getting public. And I'll come back to the idea of comparable benefits, but let me ask Jason a question here. I mean, the law is what it is, and we know that there's been back and forth in the press about Congress and the Social Security Administration and actually implementing the law. And I noticed we have a comment in the Q&A about somebody whose mom got their benefit or the refund. Where are we currently with the implementation of the Fairness Act? Where are we actually right now with it?
To be quite honest, Social Security seems to be doing a better job than I thought they would have been. Right now, since basically the numbers were updated February 25th or so, they processed about 75% of claims. So the 3.2 million that were impacted or so, they're probably somewhere around the 2.2 or 2.5 million that have been processed. And they've been telling people that they should be able to process everything by the end of March going into April. but not to reach out and contact Social Security until the end of April if you haven't gotten a check yet. But because of the automation of most of the payments and programs, they should be able, hopefully, to adjust this pretty quickly, but going into the spring. So I would say if people haven't seen an adjustment by May 1, then contact Social Security.
And of course, contacting them is getting challenging, but we'll talk about that in a moment.
Yes.
Art, let's consider planning for non-covered government workers. So you got states and municipalities that don't participate in Social Security programs we talked about. They're supposed to offer employees, in theory, retirement pensions that are comparable to what Social Security offers. What are some of the, I'll just call it the major differences between such state and pension benefits versus Social Security retirement benefits?
Yeah, see if you throw that slide up. For the actual worker, whether they're covered or uncovered, the ideal is that that worker would get comparable benefits. Now, it doesn't mean they're certainly identical, okay? But they're somewhat comparable. But you got to remember, roughly about 60 to 65% of people entering retirement are married. And it's when you get into married couples that the big differences arise. And so let's compare the differences between people who have non-covered employment pensions and people who have Social Security retirement assurance benefit or Social Security widowers insurance benefits. Let's start with the non-covered employment pensions. Okay, these sort of pensions generally lack any sort of additional benefit for the non-participating spouse. Okay, and so yes, they get a pension benefit, but if their married partner hadn't worked, there's no extra money that's going over to them. And that's very different than within the Social Security system, because they're the person who has earned their 40 credits, earned their retirement insurance benefit. There can also be a spousal benefit for their partner. At the same time, what about survivor benefits? Okay. For non-covered employment pensions, usually at the time the pension is claimed, they get an opportunity to select the size of the survivor benefit that's going to go to their spouse if the participant dies first. And so they can very commonly choose perhaps 50% continuation or 75 or even 100% continuation. And certainly the higher the percentage of continuation, there is a corresponding actuarial reduction in that non-covered employment pension for sure. But there is also the fact that there is going to continue to be paid a benefit to their surviving partner. But it's very different within Social Security. Yes, there is a widower's insurance benefit, but depending upon the relative earnings history of the two spouses, if both of those spouses were participating in Social Security, there may not be a quote-unquote survivor benefit. If the lower earning spouse dies first, the survivor just continues to get their own earned retirement insurance benefit. And that leads to a really big drop in household income. And so the point here is anybody who is giving good retirement income planning advice to couples has got to understand the details of Social Security and also the pensions. And is the pension from non-covered employment? Well, okay, it's got different characteristics from Social Security. And these factors have all got to be taken into account because, you know, the sad odds is that one of the spouses is going to die first. And there still needs to be enough money left coming in after that first death to meet the expenses of the survivor. And also got to recognize the fact that that survivor now all of a sudden is going to be taxed as a single person and no longer at the more beneficial married tax bracket rates. So these things have got to be taken into account. And just therefore, just wrap it up, just because a non-covered pension might be comparable doesn't mean for a married household that things are working out the same. They can be very different at the end.
And Steve, I'll add, because I'm seeing it come up in the Q&A, people are still somewhat confused what a covered and non-covered employment is. And so maybe we didn't do a good job writing it the first time around. So in the WEBGPO, I think it started coming in as a policy in part of the 1983 reforms. Again, to try to introduce some solvency into the system. The Constitution generally does not allow the federal government to tax the states. And so some of the states said, why should we as states pay into a federal program called Social Security when we already have, as Art mentioned, a pension plan for our state and local employees? So there was an opt-in procedure, not an opt-out, but either way you look at it. And so a lot of states chose not to cover their employees with Social Security, but instead continue with their defined benefit pension plan. So they can get teachers, firefighters, police, and some of the biggest states that were impacted the most that basically did not want to be part of Social Security and now going to be impacted by the WEBGPO are Alaska, California, Massachusetts, Ohio, Texas. Those were some of the biggest. And so residents of those states who were basically working in those non-covered employment got a pension, but some of them, of course, then worked part of their careers in what's called covered employment. And those are the things that we normally think of that pay Social Security. And those are most of the jobs in this country.
Let me just point out, I'm surprised at times to discover little pockets of non-covered employment in a state that you would otherwise think of as being generally participating in Social Security. For example, in my home state of Michigan, it's the state police that chose not to opt in to Social Security. And so they have non-covered pensions, whereas most anybody else in Michigan, if they're a state or municipal worker, they have both Social Security and a state pension. So you just can't assume, depending on the state you're in, that the person that you're providing advice to is participant in Social Security. You really need to ask.
Yeah, I just as a quick example, my father was a triple dipper because he was with the federal government back when it was under civil service, so wasn't covered for Social Security, retired early, and then got a job that was covered. So but it also had a defined benefit. So he got that defined benefit and he got Social Security. So yeah, you just could find them in strange ways. But, and there's some more fairness questions that we can look at when we get to the Q&A, but I want to make sure we give a little bit of time to talk about some of the other minor issues you've probably been hearing. So we're seeing all kinds of, I'll call them above the fold type of headlines about Social Security where people are wondering if they're going to get next week's. Some of it's pretty incendiary, but I want to get to the meat of it. And that's really, I mean, the meat of the issue is funding. So Jason, I mean, to the extent that motion can be taken out of the equation, which isn't easily right now, where do we stand with the security of the Social Security system in terms of funding? And especially, and people are already asking this in the Q&A, factoring in the Fairness Act, which wasn't discussed in the last report from Social Security, and also where are we with the whole issue of staffing to pay these benefits, the wrecking ball you referred to in the Times yesterday?
So let's talk Social Security benefits and the program's financing, and we'll get second the staffing issues of the administration of the program through the agency. So the trustees report comes out every year, and it's usually supposed to be out by mid-April. So we'll see what they're going to come out with, hopefully on time this year, next month. So the numbers I'm going to give you are from last year, and those will likely change a little bit based on some policy changes and economic changes. But the 2024 trustees report forecasted that the OASI program, that's our regular retirement program, that the trust funds would be depleted somewhere around 2033. And if you were to combine the DI trust fund with OASI, which you're legally not allowed to do unless you pass a law that does so, and Congress has done this from time to time, but you sometimes hear the news talk about the combined trust funds, then the depletion date is 2035. Basically, the DI program's additional funds can buy you 1 year of retirement. But let's stick with retirement program, the 2033. The Social Security Fairness Act will probably bring that closer down to somewhere in the 2032 by about 6 months. But we also have to think about now also the revenues going into the program. We're seeing some layoffs happen with government employees, current government employees that are what's called covered employment. So again, the post-1984 federal employees do pay into Social Security. If there's a recession coming up, that will reduce revenues into the trust fund. But generally, from a financing standpoint, we should assume that somewhere in the next 10 years, the Social Security's trust funds will be depleted. And what that means is that if Congress does nothing by then, Social Security by law cannot borrow its own money, so it would have to only pay out in benefits what it collects in revenue, and that would result in a 20% reduction in benefits across the board. To put the program on a solvency basis, if we wait till that 2033 moment, and when you want 75 years of solvency, you'd have to reduce benefits by 25% across the board, or raise payroll taxes by 4 percentage points. So that'd be 2 percentage points on the employer, 2 on the employee. So your 12.4% would go to 16.4%. And that's if Congress does nothing. And to give you an idea of what this means, like in dollars, so we talk about present value. If I was to put money in the bank today at a regular discount rate for Treasury bills that would fund the gap for the next 75 years, we're talking about $22.6 trillion of unfunded liability. So the program faces real financial challenges. The question is, what's going to happen about it? Is Congress going to show some leadership? I don't see anything happening at least the next 2 years. Congress seems very good right now about waiting until a fiscal cliff the night before something ends, whether it's a government shutdown and budget. Maybe they wait till the end and do Social Security reform at the last minute. I also don't see Congress allowing a 20% benefit cut overnight. So you think what would maybe happen? Maybe there's some sort of general revenue financing that goes in and makes up the difference for a short period of time. But that's about $400 billion a year right now of a shortfall if they were to borrow. But maybe they do something to allow then some reforms to happen. And where that goes, it could be some sort of change the retirement age, which takes a while to phase in. We just did the 83 reforms, took 40 years to phase in to raise the retirement age from 65 to 67. We just got there. You can raise taxes overnight. You can't really change the retirement age overnight. They're going to do it. So we'll probably see something hit high income earners. But the sooner Congress acts, the smaller that delta is, the longer the wait, the bigger that delta is. That's kind of where the finances are. We can tease more if you have questions. On the staffing side, this is a little bit problematic and we're concerned. And this is a nonpartisan answer. We've had Democrats and Republicans, former administration officials, commissioners, me as a deputy commissioner, concerned about how staffing is being addressed at the agency. And this is not to say that government agencies can't find efficiencies and save money. That is not the question. But for anyone who's ever worked in business, whether they've done it on a self-employment basis, as a small business owner or worked for a large company that has gone through restructuring, you know you have a strategic plan or a business plan or some sort of plan. It's not just an across-the-board headcount reduction or getting rid of the people who are recently just hired, like probationary employees. You have to be strategic about where you want to keep your resources. And we've seen a lot of early retirements from the senior executive service, which means we're going to lose some institutional knowledge. And then the acting commissioners announced they're reducing the 10 regions down to 4. That seems like a lot of reduction for me, because if you think about the 1,300 field offices that Social Security has, they funnel up to each of the 10 regions in a proportional way. And if you want a hard question answer they can't answer in the field office, it goes to the regional offices. If you now take 6 of those out, all those questions now have to get funneled through 4 as to 10, and that's going to delay answers. And if people aren't there to answer the questions, it might not get answered at all.
Wow. Well, and to take this one step further, Art, you and I were talking. You've incurred some situations that reflect, I'm going to use the word advisedly, panic that consumers are feeling about the current status of Social Security. So I think it would just help if the audience some of the conversations you've had with people.
Yeah, people hear a lot of things in the news. They read them in the media. They don't always catch all the subtleties. I had my aunt call me about 2 weeks ago from California. She was practically in tears. She had heard on the news what she thought was a statement that her benefits were going to stop being paid in 90 days. And she was in an absolute panic. She depends on her Social Security. And so trying to understand, what was it you listened to? What channel? What were they saying? I could, begin to learn things were heard, but misheard. But as we've already talked about in terms of loss aversion and financial, behavioral finance, people really emotionally respond negatively to financial losses. And I think that probably many of those listening in today are going to have clients who probably already called them, having perhaps misheard something in the media in a panic. And if you, as a listener, haven't encountered this already, I think you will. I think you need to be ready to acknowledge the feelings, the strong feelings that people are going to have, but then try to help them carefully understand what's really going on.
Yeah, and that is a good segue to this fact. So how we as advisors can help our clients and our friends and our neighbors. Jason, you spoke at the American Colleges Horizon Conference 2 weeks ago. It went great. What was your message? What is your message to advisors about how to deal with their clients' Social Security panic issues, how to deal with this in what's obviously an unexpected and impassioned environment.
Yeah, I think part of this is the first thing is don't panic, which you said people are panicking. I think that's correct. We are hearing from financial advisors that their clients are coming in, hearing that the trust funds are going to be depleted, or they hear that Social Security is running out of money, Social Security is going bankrupt. I think an advisor can try to hopefully calm down and say what's going on. Trust fund depletion does not mean bankruptcy. So again, assume Congress did nothing and they just let it all, the trust funds go depleted. A 20% across the board reduction is not bankruptcy. I'm not saying it's good, but it's not bankruptcy. So Social Security is going to be there. So, and I do think Congress will do something. So that's the first thing. It's not going bankrupt. The second question they get is people are coming in and around 62 and they're asking to take Social Security benefits early at 62 because they're afraid if they wait, they'll get cut or they won't be there for them. So they should take what they should have now. And again, I think that goes back to the first answer is walk people through in a calm manner that Social Security will still be there for them. And the benefits of delayed claiming, if they can afford to delay, benefit them, a spouse if they have it. And again, the nomenclature used for Social Security, I think, is misleading. Social Security talks about age 62 as the early eligibility age. And I'm like, who wants to be late for government benefits? They hear early, they sign up. They should call it as the minimum monthly benefit age. And that gets a conversation going, and advisors should use that. We also have age 67 called the full or normal retirement age. I'm not sure about what's normal about 67. And I sure know it's not full, because if you take a glass of water and you fill it, you can't add any more in without it spilling over. But of course, you can delay claiming to 70 and get more money. So 62 should be the minimum monthly benefit age, 70 the maximum monthly benefit age. And then we talk about what's in between, or tell clients anything below age 70 you claim as a penalty. So change the nomenclature and have a discussion with them. But I think part of this is walking through and not being panicky about what's going on right now, but also being considered, understanding that for people who do need assistance, it will take longer to get help from Social Security right now. Maybe plan ahead for a delay in the filing. If you're filing for benefits, it might take longer to get benefits, your application through.
And just putting my own 2 bits into it, can I also say in some of the Q&A, we have to recognize we're in a very partisan environment, a very emotional one. And if I can throw in a thought, is we got to make sure when we're talking to our clients that we are their advisor more than their friend, meaning that I remember when Obamacare came out and people were on one side or on the other side of it. And if the advisor is in a situation where they're just saying, yeah, isn't it terrible? Well, they're going to get rid of that. Have you done your client a favor? So I think one of the things we have to remind ourselves is we're there as advisors more than compatriots and friends to just try to put at least some sense of reality. And Art, we've talked about it. You and I are both in Social Security, so it's very near and dear to our heart. Anything you want to add as far as how you think you work with clients on these kind of issues?
Well, I mean, I will tell you right now, I get that paycheck in the 4th Wednesday of every month, and I know what that dollar amount is. And thinking about a 20% reduction of that, perhaps even more, it generates strong emotions. From a behavioral finance perspective, that's system 1 emotional thinking. I know that I have to take a step back, calmly think through my plan, everything else I know, so that I'm in a position just for myself to make sound decisions. And I think that same way of thinking, we've got to encourage in all of our clients. We acknowledge their emotions, but then help them more rationally view what's really going on, what their plan is, that they've got a solid plan, and to stick with it.
Well, related to that, and you mentioned this, Jason, we have time to talk about a topic that I think is near and dear to people's minds, and it's an advisory one. And I said it's coming up here about the 20% reduction. First of all, to be clear, the way it's supposed to work is pro rata. So whether you just retired or you're going to retire years down the line, the fact is they need to have a reduction because it's kind of a pay-go system. So we all know that the rule of thumb, and that's just it, a rule of thumb, nothing more. Financially, it's better to delay filing for Social Security, especially if you're married. And, we cover that in our RICP. I've done some present value calculations to the effect as to what's the effect of delaying if there's going to be a haircut right about the time you retire. In other words, you're just getting ready to retire and suddenly they, do a 20% drop or whatever. And overall, my calculations tell me it still appears to make sense to delay in most situations, not all. And it's just that the break-even year, as for how many years you have to live until it makes more sense to have delayed, might move out a couple years. But if it was 80 before and it's moved to 82 and life expectancy is 86, you're still coming out better to delay. Jason or Art, do either of you have a thought about this whole issue about how to address the question of, well, listen, everything's crazy right now. Why don't I just take the money and run?
Well, let me give an initial context background, then Art can give a more technical answer. So when I was at Social Security in the late 2000s, the agency was still using what was called the break-even analysis, and you mentioned that, Steve. And basically what they said is someone came into Social Security age 62, and they asked the claims rep, when should I take Social Security retirement benefits? The agency would tell them, hey, you're 62. If you take it now, you'll be ahead for 14 years. So you'd get a lower monthly check for the rest of your life as opposed to a higher monthly check for a less period of time if you delayed. But people heard this 14 years and went, oh my God, that's a great deal. Why shouldn't I take it? The agency never said to them, if you live then past 76, you'll be behind for the rest of your life. And what we did, we changed that nomenclature. Social Security got rid of the break even. They now have a double-sided one-pager that says when to claim Social Security benefits and talks about it being a personal decision. One of the most impactful things is just a bar chart that says if you're going to get, say, $1,000 at your full retirement age, and I don't like that, but at age 67, you'd get $700 at age 62. That's a 30% reduction in your monthly Social Security benefit that lasts the rest of your life. If you delay claiming till 72, you get $1,240. That's a 24% increase in your monthly benefit that, again, lasts for the rest of your life and is inflation protected. The difference between that age 62 monthly benefit and age 70 is 77%. So again, you start taking about, no one knows when they're going to die. And I think for people who need the money right away, you take it. But if you can afford to delay claiming, it makes financial sense because that then inflation adjusted amount that lasts the rest of your life, you might need it more when you're older and have higher healthcare costs or something else. And it helps you weather financial, market conditions. If you have that higher benefit, you can use that for your bills and not to draw down a market, especially in down times like today. So I think it's still important. And if you have a 20% reduction, I'd rather have a 20% reduction on a much higher amount and still then have more monthly income than have a lower amount and not have that income be adequate for my resources in retirement. Art?
Yeah, these benefits, we call them workers' benefits, is retirement insurance benefits. And we need to remember, this is a form of insurance that is very valuable. Because of the inflation adjustment, it gives you some valuable protection against unknown future inflation. It's longevity insurance because nobody really knows how long they're going to live. It's one thing if I delay claiming and I happen to die early, but I had all the money I needed. Well, there's not as much legacy, but I and my spouse have done okay. The other situation is not so pretty. You take your benefits early, you and your spouse have a long life, you had that reduction in benefits, money's getting tight. You don't have as much inflation protection. And your later years, as health insurance cost and medical procedure cost rise, you can really get squeezed. So I think an insurance perspective, rather than a pure break-even perspective, does a better job of helping your clients make a wise decision as they're viewing this.
Yeah, and Dr. Boyd Fowl, who many of you know that listen to this, and I did a paper a couple of years ago, and we were looking at, you have to integrate this with your overall planning, not just looking at Social Security and Social Security only. So one of the things we were looking at is if, say, you have a target of $4,000 a month and you have $1 million saved up type thing, so you're trying to figure out your biggest legacy value. You're not living paycheck to paycheck. What makes most sense? Well, one is the issue of 62 versus, let's say, waiting all the way to 70, but also with that portfolio money, do you put it in under your mattress? Do you put it in a conservative portfolio of just fixed? Or do you do a 50-50 between equity and fixed? And what we found is, let's say, I won't go through all the numbers, but we basically came up with this, is if you go with 62 and like a all fixed income type of portfolio, it's going to be a coin toss whether you're going to make your bogey. In other words, it's 50-50 whether it's even going to make it. But if you take that same person, wait to age 70 and assume normal age, and we were doing Monte Carlo on this, and look at a 50-50 or a 75-25 split between equity and fixed, you were solid, you were gold, you were going to be okay. So as we think through this, we got to remember that it's part of the overall retirement planning process, not just retirement. I mean, not just Social Security itself. Whew, okay.
Yeah, people would really like to try to make things simple by breaking out the Social Security claiming decision as an entirely separate step. There's so much good research that's been coming out in the last 10 years, pointing out that all aspects of the retirement income plan must be integrated together, and that a total plan can really shift around, often to later claiming ages, can shift that Social Security claiming age. And an older claiming age enables you, for example, to have more space in your 60s to perform Roth conversions, which can be very beneficial, especially for people who might be subject to what's termed the Social Security tax torpedo. Increasing the Social Security benefits by delaying until 70 can really reduce the explosive impact of that tax torpedo and can really improve the overall plan. So, what I'm really trying to say here, you have to integrate all choices within the retirement income plan in order to end up with the optimal plan. You just can't look at Social Security as a standalone decision.
One more question I want to ask before we go into Q&A, because we got a lot of Q&A. And by the way, folks, some of you I think are venting, and I get it. I have my own thoughts on it, so we're not going to get into the politics part of it, just so you know. But one of the proposals that President Trump has talked about is not taxing the Social Security benefit. Jason, I'm just kind of curious if you have any numbers or any indication on how big a hit that would be. And flip it the other way is, because we had some people say, what if you did it as means testing? So as we all know with IRMA on Medicare, they pick up some revenue for those of us who are still working. And so our Medicare's, well, that's twice what the normal one is. But the question for you is on Social Security, how big a difference would it make whether we tax none of it or we tax all of it with some kinds of means testing?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is because President Trump has campaigned on potential proposals that would not tax Social Security benefits and then also not tax tips, which are two sources of revenues for the Social Security program. Let's just focus on not taxing Social Security benefits for retirees. That could increase deficits by up to $2 trillion over the 10-year budget window. And it would increase the Social Security 75-year solvency by about 25%, almost 1% of taxable payroll. And what that means is that you would advance the insolvency date of Social Security's trust fund by over a year. So we're already doing 6 months for the Social Security Fairness Act, add over another year for no tax on Social Security benefits. But that also increases the insolvency date of the Medicare HI trust fund by 6 years. So it's a big hit. If you add the no tax on tips, that with the no tax on retirement would be a 3-year hit to the Social Security's trust fund depletion date, moving it up 3 years closer. I don't think Congress is going to be able to do both of those. In other words, I don't think we're going to see a complete policy that says no tax on tips. Maybe they do something for political purposes to get a small group of people for political public policy purposes. We do tax some retirement Social Security benefits today. I don't think that's going to get included in this current year, but you never know. And then it goes to the other point about, well, would we see means testing? So when we talk about means testing, what people think of, and I technically talk to about, is you see your monthly benefit check get reduced. And so if you're going to get $2,000 and we take 10% off the top, you now get $1,800. People see that $200 go off and they're angry about it because, again, this is the loss aversion that Art talked about. They get angry. I don't think Congress will ever do means testing in that way. But what I could see Congress doing as a revenue source is making 100% of Social Security benefits taxable on someone's 1040. So you'd still get the same amount of monthly benefit you've been promised. But when you go to file your tax return, depending on your other income sources you have, Social Security could be taxed either at your ordinary income rates or at a separate rate like capital gains. And most people won't even know it directly because when you fill out your tax return, you put all these numbers in and it says, what do you owe? What do you get back as a refund? Where they would visibly see a reduction in monthly Social Security checks that was quote unquote means tested. So I don't think we'll see means testing because that also could imply that you might need it in some years and don't, and you're going to get hit. If it's done in a tax return, it could be based on annual income. So one year, if you look quote unquote rich, you might see a reduction on the 1040 and you pay it in. Other years when you don't, you get the full benefit and it's not taxed. It allows for some nuance. We won't see that now, but that could be a reform option we see in the future when they do tackle Social Security reform.
That's going to be interesting. And I noticed several of the questions we got deal with what they might do to change things. So we'll go ahead and get into the Q&A here. And while I'm going to ask Art and Jason to look, and while I am as well in the Q&A, I just want to mention, if you want to do a deep dive on Social Security, one great way to do it is the RICP program, which the new and improved version is coming out very soon. So I do want to encourage you on that. Just looking at some of the Q&As, and I'm trying to think in this out loud. When we go back to some of the Fairness Act questions, one asked about divorce and another asked about effect on your Medicare coming out of your Social Security check. And I'm just trying to think on my feet about this. I think it's just all things being equal. In other words, if you weren't covered before and now, or I mean, WEP took it out, or now you are. Well, let's look at the GPO, a divorced spouse. It would just depend on when we're filing, right, Art? I mean, what if somebody was already on Social Security and now is going to get more because of the Fairness Act? How does that affect a divorced spouse?
My understanding is that if they are already in the system, that is, have filed, that it should be an automatic adjustment.
Okay.
Now, if for whatever reason they thought there's no sense in filing, I'm not going to get any benefits, they're going to get all reduced down to nothing, that person probably is going to need to try to make an appointment to file for benefits. You know, I've talked with several people in the state of Ohio that were covered and had uncovered work, and were not going to, from their view, receive any spousal benefits because their state pension was too big. I've encouraged them now, set up that appointment as soon as they can so that they can file and begin at least to have a shot at retroactively getting some benefits now, in this case, that the GPO is eliminated. So I think it's a comparable way of thinking.
Yeah, okay. And I assume one of the people ask, as far as Medicare, I guess if your benefit goes up, that's just more money that they might pull Medicare out of. But I don't think, the only thing I don't know is with the cutting back on staff, whether any of these adjustments are going to be hard to do because you went from X benefit to Y benefit now. But it's just going to take Medicare out of whatever it has to work with, right? I'm going with yes.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
So let's see. Did you, first of all, before I go on, I know the other big one that we have a lot of questions on. And I know you reference it, Jason, but what's the thinking on how big of a hit to the trust fund will occur because of the GPO and WEP, or the Fairness Act? How big is it as far as what it might end up speeding up the depletion of the fund?
The best estimates are 6 months. And so that should be incorporated into the next trustees report that, again, hopefully comes out next month. Because that law was, of course, signed in January, so they have plenty of time to do the analysis for the current trustees report. Any additional changes, like if there's no tax on tips or they don't tax Social Security benefits going forward, that won't be into the next trustees report, but the best estimates are about 1 year closer trust fund depletion on the no taxation retirement benefits for Social Security, and additional 2 years if they don't tax tips.
And I just want to mention, since we have one of the experts listening to us, Heather Schreiber, she put, because I know if she put an answer, it's right, a divorced non-covered spouse who was denied before due to GPO should be among the retroactive group that should get a lump sum benefit by the end of March. So if they never filed, they should file now to protect their filing date. Yeah, that makes good sense. Thank you for contributing that.
And I'll add to just to follow up the question that if we don't do anything on Social Security and they were to pass all of these things, like again, WEBCAST has already gone over the Fairness Act, but if they do no tax on tips and no tax on retirement benefits for Social Security, that 20% reduction we talked about at trust fund depletion would be 33% at trust fund depletion. So again, it not only hastens trust fund depletion, but it increases the delta would have to be made up by benefit reductions if nothing is done.
Okay. Did either one of you see anything else you wanted to mention on the Fairness Act before I get into next set of questions?
The only thing I'd add, because we're thinking about what now happens within the next 9 years or so, or if we ever do get a commission for Social Security reform, whenever that happens, if it does. Again, the WEBGPO came out of the 83 reforms. Now, the question is, would it come back into play? I think given the politics, they might not. But one of the reform options that has been floated is called mandatory coverage. And it would be to try to find some way to get all state and local workers into Social Security as covered employees. And so that might be on the table, and that would get rid of any issue of fairness with that GPO if those employees that were non-covered were all of a sudden part of the Social Security system as covered employees for their entire career.
Okay. Then let me ask this, because a lot of the questions are dealing with, okay, we know the situation we're in. How's the government going to fix it? So we know, I mean, they've talked about moving up the wage cap. You know, Medicare has an unlimited one. That's one of them. We talked about means testing. I'd just be interested, particularly Jason, in your thoughts about if Congress asks you to come in again and make some suggestions for how to fix it. So it's 1983, and we have Tip O'Neill and President Reagan talking again. What kind of things do we need to do to fix it?
So I think this is looking at history, not just for Social Security, but for legislation in general, that the ones that seem to have the most legitimacy for the American public and that have the most staying power are those that are done on a bipartisan basis, which means each side has to give something up. That means Republicans are going to have to agree to some sort of revenue increases, and that likely would mean an increase in the payroll tax. My guess is it'd be 2 percentage points in total, 1 percentage point by the employer, 1 by the employee. So 12.4 goes to 14.4 just for Social Security, not including Medicare. There'll be some changes to the benefit formula, meaning there'll probably be something that reduces benefits for higher income workers, raises the retirement age slowly, like we did over 40 years with the 83 reforms. We probably go to 69 or 70. And then you get to the payroll tax maximum. The cap would probably either be lifted, so it covers what was historically 90% of covered wages, which could be anywhere today to about $300,000, $350,000. Or you've heard of this donut hole, which is basically you don't tax between the taxable maximum, say $400,000. You tax everything above that. And over time, as the taxable maximum grows, it would catch up to that 400, and then everything would be covered within a period of 10 to 20 years or something. I think those are what we're going to see being most likely as the main levers. Because again, you only got a few levers you can pull. The revenue side, the benefit side, they're going to have to do something with those dials to make it work. But I think it's going to be some sort of compromise so everyone feels some bit of pain to get us back on a 75-year solvency. Or maybe we drop 75 years solvency and try to just get 25, 35, or 50.
And on the revenue side, a quick question, because it's come up in a couple of places, the earnings test. And remind everybody, the earnings test basically says if you retire early and making us over a certain amount, what we're going to do is reduce your benefits. For every $2 you make, we'll reduce by 1, and then we basically make it up in the formula later on. Is that a revenue neutral provision, or because some people are saying we ought to get that reform to get rid of it? Would it cost money to get rid of the earnings test, or is that kind of revenue neutral since they ultimately pay you back the money later on?
It depends on sometimes how it's scored. There's the chief actuary, if you go on Social Security's website and just like Google Social Security Administration reform proposals, they have a whole bunch. They've done provisions and proposals for scoring. I like to think of it as being somewhere in between neutral plus or minus. So it's not a big hit. But the reason they have the retirement earnings test, and again, people think of it as a tax because if they start getting Social Security and work before the full retirement age, they see money coming out and they think it's a tax. It recalculates your benefits. But the reason it was done, and Art sort of alluded to the general nature of Social Security, is Social Security is an insurance program. It's an income replacement program that is designed to replace income when you are not working. So when you stop working, basically retire, or if you're on disability, can't work. And so the idea was if you were taking benefits before the full retirement age, you're still working, you don't need your full Social Security benefit. You're working, they would take some away, then recalculate your benefits, and you get more later after you hit the full retirement age. I think the problem, though, is it's so confusing for people and for analysts that it's just not worth the hassle. So just, I think, on a complexity issue, and because it's not going to make or break a big difference on the trust fund, it probably at this point is better just to get rid of it. Plus, also, it might discourage some people from working in their 62, 63, 64. And I think as we start thinking about retirement security as being income as the outcome in retirement and different sources of income to make finances, meet, you might think about Social Security as part of it, your investments, and you might also consider working, whether it's age 62, 65, 70, or later, as part of your income. So we shouldn't do things that behaviorally discourage working.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Well, we're almost top of the hour, so I really want to thank Jason and Art for their really excellent commentary. It's a big issue right now, and I want to thank the audience, by the way, for attending. Just be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where a lot of these types of presentations are available, and also obviously look at our website. So. There we go. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And again, make sure you get your CE there. Art, Jason, thank you so much. A very important and timely topic.
Thanks for having us on, Steve. And my apologies to everyone. We have over 100 questions in the Q&A, and sorry we couldn't get to them all, but I appreciate people leaving their comments.
Exactly. Thanks.
Expand your opportunities at theamericancollege.edu.